I think everyone in this room knows the failures of the Bush administration on foreign policy. The Iraq War is a disaster. The lies that got us into it have depleted U.S. credibility, which we need to address future conflicts. Global terrorism is rising. The last State Department report in 2004 showed it tripling under Bush. Osama bin Laden's at large, and the pattern of U.S. human rights abuse is both morally wrong, but also strategically counterproductive. Whoever wins in 2008, which is something we've also talked about at this conference, whoever wins is going to inherit all of these problems, and they're going to reverberate throughout the next term for foreign policy. Many of these failures can be repeated, and what I want to focus on is one that I think is most likely to continue, and that is the conception of the global war on terrorism. And it looks likely, I think, because the war on terror is a sweeping formulation that's been so widely embraced in United States politics that it's hard to imagine an administration from either party challenging that orthodoxy. But I think that's exactly what we must do, and I think all the people in this room and throughout this conference and the Netroots at large can help do it. So what exactly is the global war on terror? It is an endless war to eradicate all terrorism everywhere. As the President said in a 2001 speech, after al-Qaeda, the war, quote, will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. That entire objective is fatally flawed. It organizes our foreign policy against a tactic instead of an enemy. So declaring a war on terror is like declaring a war on war, as Zbigniew Brzezinski has said, and it is as vague and as useless. This vague, broad organization, as we all know, has served Bush's politics. And so every sin we think of in the Bush administration, Iraq, domestic spying, Abu Ghraib, it always gets fit back into this global war on terror paradigm. This is not just the talking points, which we all think about in terms of framing and being savvy about politics. It's in the formal policy, in the legal authority that they have in mind. I want to give just a few examples, although I think everyone here is pretty knowledgeable. But in August 2002, Alberto Gonzales said the administration could invade Iraq without congressional authorization because of the war on terror. Last October, Condi Rice said the same thing about Syria in testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And of course, how does this administration defend warrantless domestic spying, the panel we had just before this one? Again, they say it's part of the war on terror. They're authorized to do it. It's not just the talking points. They say it under oath in court. So where's the opposition to all this? Well, instead of providing an alternative, many Washington Democrats over the past few years have actually been reinforcing the global war on terror paradigm. And I think for years, leading Democrats have confined their foreign policy, arguments within the war on terror. But I think what we're looking at in terms of public opinion in the country right now is better strategic thinking and a desire for a different policy. So people are asking, why are we still in Iraq? Why is Osama bin Laden still loose? And while these are very complex issues, I think that the failure itself starts to distill an alternative. Then the outline would be that we at least must focus on defeating the enemy, not the tactic. So instead of conceptualizing a global war on all terrorism, we need a focused war on al-Qaeda, on Osama bin Laden, and on the jihadists who are following his game plan. Now, I'm not talking about a rebranding. I'm talking about the policy objective. And ours should be to defeat the enemies who attacked us on 9/11 and those who pose a credible threat in terms of terrorism in the United States. It should not be to defeat all terrorism everywhere, pursue preemption, or, I think, to install democracy across the globe. Now, this takes a lot of details, and there's trade-offs, and this is complicated. I think when Alex speaks with his experience in Iraq, he'll give a lot more detail than I can. But at the macro level, I would say this does give us a few choices in terms of how we think about an alternative. I think it means realism, not neoconservatism. It means jihadists and al-Qaeda, not Iraq. It means international cooperation to fight a transnational threat, not unilateralism. And I think it means restoring American values, human rights, and the rule of law, while enhancing our global standing, not betraying our Constitution. Now, you all know none of this is really a collection of new ideas. But I don't think as progressives we outline them often enough as the connective tissue in this war on jihadists and specific enemies and in opposition to Bush's global war on terrorism. Now, a few Democrats and foreign policy leaders have tried. Ambassador Richard Holbrooke called for replacing the war on terror with, quote, a war against Osama bin Laden and his followers. Holbrooke made the unpopular but accurate observation that many movements use terrorism to attack the established order. So Bush's focus on the tactic in general is doomed to fail. Chris Bowers, the blogger over at MyDD, sparked a similarly important debate in 2004, and he called for Democrats to abandon the war on terror, which is something that I think scares consultants and other folks who are thinking about campaigns. But he argued, I think persuasively, that this was a frame invented by Bush speechwriters to pin down the foreign policy debate, and that when Democrats use that frame, that's what helped, one thing that helped Bush get reelected. Here's exactly what Chris wrote in 04. By repeatedly and unquestionably reinforcing the war on terror frame, we aided conservatives. That we continue to claim that Bush is losing the war on terror and that conservatives do not understand the war on terror only serves to worsen the problem. And Chris said, the problem is not, like many hawks would have us believe, that we're not taking national security seriously. The problem is that we failed to separate Iraq from the war on terrorism in the minds of voters in 2004. And if we go back a little further, this alternative, what I'm talking about here, I think also emerged before the Iraq war vote. Senator Bob Graham introduced a proposal to name and authorize force against top terrorist threats in the United States before that vote. And he presciently argued that invading Iraq would increase the threat level, as it has, and doing so without a precise attack on al-Qaeda and the terrorists that are a true enemy was a mistake. Now, I think many people probably don't remember the Graham proposal. The media barely covered it, and the Senate overwhelmingly tabled it on the eve of the Iraq war vote. But as I finish up my remarks here, I want to revisit that. I went back and I read the congressional record from that night, and it's very telling. After Graham's speech outlining what I'm talking about here, terrorists, a greater threat than Saddam Hussein, the first people to take the floor in opposition to that idea were the co-sponsors of the Iraq War resolution, Senators Joe Lieberman and John McCain. McCain retorted that, quote, Iraq and al-Qaeda are two faces of the same evil. Now, history has vindicated Senator Graham and revealed that McCain and Lieberman were not only wrong then, but embarrassingly and stubbornly wrong now because they repeat the same arguments today. So Graham voted against the war, and here's how he explained it on the Senate floor. With sadness, I predict we will live to regret this day, October 10th, 2002, when we stood by and we allowed those terrorist organizations to continue in the shadows. The number one priority should be terrorism and its threat to the people of the United States in our homeland. Our top targets should be those groups that have the greatest potential to repeat what happened on September 11th. And this is how he ended his remarks that night. The statesman who yields to war fever must realize that once the signal is given, he is no longer the master of policy, but the slave of unforeseeable and uncontrollable events. As we consider our foreign policy today together, I think Americans want out of Iraq if possible. They resent the lies that got us into war, including distortions of terrorism, like McCain's comment about Iraq and al-Qaeda. And in general, I think this may sound pretty obvious now, and especially here, because we have so many activists and writers who've been making these points and pushing for alternatives. But we still work with a media that lauds pro-war politicians for their resolve, even now, even when their arguments deny reality. And I think our political discourse is larded with concerns that any alternative to the war on terror will have some sort of weakness, instead of discussing the merits up front about our security. But I think the Netroots and many other people who are grassroots Democrats and other Americans who simply want a different foreign policy are beginning to realize we have to change that. And I think we, as activists, as writers, and as a community, can help do that. Thank you.